Welcome back. You are on the Q with Q. You are here for another episode of Q the Mind, and we are now at week 4. Time has been flying, but we have had a great start. Last week, we talked about when access isn't advantage, and this week we are back now for episode 4, and we will be leaning into the last page strategy, gaining control of a wandering mind. Again, that is the last page strategy, gaining control of a wandering mind. And so this week, we're going to just, again, start with some reflection, start out with a story. And so, this one takes me back to my childhood, and a quite impactful story for me as I reflected on it, and came up with this podcast idea. So when I was young, roughly, and this actually is both in part of when I was in middle school, 7th and 8th grade. And so I went to a private school when I was younger, and we used a curriculum called a Becca book. And it was out of Pensacola, Florida. It was a Christian school down there that had a curriculum that essentially put you a grade ahead of where, your typical state standards were. And so as a part of our reading comprehension curriculum, we would get hit with these very random reading comprehension quizzes where we would have a chapter book with short stories in it. These short stories already had a specific word count, and there was a time stamp on how long it should take a student to get through these stories. And there are 5 question comprehension quizzes at the end of these stories that were worth 20 points apiece. So, if you get 1 wrong, you're already at a B minus. If you get 2 wrong, you're already at a D minus. And so there was little room for error with these particular quizzes. And I did not do well at these. And it was not because I was not a great reader. I could read. I had great reading comprehension. But what I did not have was reading stamina or focus. Reading stamina is very much a educational term, but I lack sustained focus to be able to stay with those books. So when that room went quiet, when the teacher hit that timer, I was good probably for a few minutes, into where eventually my thoughts would just be loud. The room is quiet, and I mean my mind is everywhere. Thinking about things that's going on at home, thinking about, situations that are going on, whatever emotions I was running through at that time. You're talking about the mind of a young black teenage adolescent male who's like everywhere at that time. So pausing and like after getting a few of these quizzes, my mom was very much into, my academics. So she's like, hey, what is going on here? And I would just tell her like, hey, I can't remain focused. Like, I haven't necessarily talked to my teacher about this, but this was a struggle for me. And my mom, understanding who I was at that point, realized that I needed a strategy. I was very much of a discourse thinker, and I needed a way to, like, how do I pull my mind in? And so she gave me an idea that, worked for me, but it has worked for me beyond just middle school, but it has worked for me in life. And that idea is what I've called the last page strategy. This strategy essentially had me, instead of just starting out with the story, go to the end of the story and read the last couple of paragraphs to get an idea of what the outcome was of this particular story. So that way I could benchmark myself along the way of like, hey, how did we get to that outcome? I then was able to pursue this story with the question of my mind, why was the ending the way that it was? And so it helped that process of that sustained inquiry or that sustained focus to be able to get through the story. And even if I did not get all the way to the end, if there was a gap, I was able to make a conscious guess or a educated guess on why that outcome was the way that it was. I immediately saw roughly a 20% increase on what those quizzes were. I went from typically getting anywhere from a 40 to 60% because I would get 2 to 3 out of 5 wrong, to now only getting 1 to 2 wrong at any given time that we took these quizzes. Why is this important? I was having a struggle with bridling my mind. And this is not something that, is unique to me. I see it all the time in adolescence, and I see it very much moving from adolescence into young adulthood, into very much mature adulthood, where we have this very tough time quieting our mind. And so that is today's story, and we're going to use that to dive into next the 4F formula and break down the fact, the fluency, the function, and the freedom points of this story. So, fact, let's start there. I love to start with research, and so I have two research points that I want to dive into as a result of this story. The first one is just around academics. This is taken from the University of Rhode Island. And this research shows that there is a positive relationship between sustained attention and reading comprehension. In adolescence, those with better sustained attention perform better on comprehension tasks, suggested that focused stamina matters for reading success in teens. And so this essentially like lays out exactly what I was going through. If I do not have sustained stamina, then the reading comprehension is only going to be as great as what I am able to sustain that focus. So that's very important. So we're going to place that data point to the side. The next one is from the Institute for the Future. This was a survey conducted roughly 8 years ago, 2017, give or take. And the name of this article is called The American Future Gap. I will put this within the notes in YouTube, so that way folks can access this. But they did a survey on roughly 2,800, a little bit over 2,800 adults around just long-term goals. And less than 30% made long-term goals. With those that identified long-term goals, they maxed out at 4.4 years. So mind you, only less than 30% actually identified as making long-term goals, with those that were within that 30% population identified that their long-term goals maxed out at roughly 4.4 years. So this is very important because many of us, we have never learned really to get that mind off of autopilot, and it is showing beyond just a sustained focus, application. We can also look at this just from how we are able to focus in our everyday lives, and the fact that Americans have not been able to push past a 4.4 year time span in sustained planning lets us know that we have not really fully been able to bridle that mind all the way. And so, I talk about this practically in every episode, like how our attention is constantly being yanked by all the different things that's been thrown at us in society, social media, those different things. So just like I couldn't stay with that short story, adults today struggle to stay with their own story, what their own purpose is, and very much have a troublesome time being able to be present when the moment calls for it. So with that being said, how does that move us into fluency? What deeper understanding must we develop? So when we think about bridling the mind or gaining control of a wandering mind, it isn't just about shutting the mind off altogether. It isn't just about quieting things down. It's about training it. So it's really about those gentle tugs. When you think about putting a bridle on a horse and having those blinders on, you're keeping its focus in one direction, and that gentle tug to the left pulls it. That gentle tug to the right, it pulls it in the direction that you want it to be able to go. And so when we think about that gentle tug, I remember when there was a moment when I wanted to kind of pull back on how much time I was spending online. So I went in my iPhone and I set those different screen time apps to say like, hey, anytime that I'm on a social app, start that timer. I want to see how quickly I am reaching an hour. And little to my own surprise, like I was hitting that hour before I was even getting to noon, right? That was my gentle tug. That was that gentle tug to the left or to the right saying like, hey, alert, alert, you're kind of going out of bounds here, right? And so while I did not just stop, what it did is let me know like, hey, you are on your phone a lot prior to noon. And before you knew it, that alert was popping up at 2:00. Then it was popping up at 4:00. Before you know it, I was getting all the way to the end of the day prior to getting that alert. It was due to that gentle tug. I was not trying to turn off this thing all at one time. That's not realistic for anyone. But putting those gentle tugs in place for yourself starts to alert you like, hey, this is where I am. And if you have a goal of where you want to be, that helps. And that's the last page strategy, like really identifying what that end goal was. So if it's for me, hey, no more than an hour a day, I started to use that gentle tug to retrain my mind to put that phone down in a way that was keeping my scroll time at an hour or less per day. So that's what we need to understand in order to develop that. And so the idea of reading the last page first taught me something early. Sometimes control starts simply with perspective. When you know where you're going, it's easier to stay grounded in the process. And so as simple as just staying within that 1 hour, that helped keep me grounded. So now that we've looked at what understanding we must develop, let's look at function. How do we actually apply this understanding? So what I want to do is just talk about 3 strategies to help bridle your mind or gain control of that wandering mind in these circumstances. The first one is just simply anchor the moment, right? So before you react to anything, like even as you're listening to this right now, even if you need to pause, anchor in the moment. What areas can you use bridling at within your mind? Like what within your thought process can use a little bit of slowing down? And so, before you react, breathe and name what's happening in the right now. My mind is racing, right? But I'm safe. I'm in a space where I can, one, just accept the fact that my mind is a little bit all over the place. But I'm safe in this moment. And what I'm going to do is try to push those thoughts out a little bit at a time and rewire yourself to focus on what is actually happening in the right now. What do I see? What do I smell? What can I feel? What do I hear? And process what is going on. These are like some of the first steps to being able to fully meditate. 2, reverse read your situation, or in an academic sense, the way that we use this term is backwards mapping. So start with your end in mind. That last page strategy. What is the last page of your story? What is the last page of the chapter you're currently in? What you want that to be like? Really focus in on what your outcome is based on wherever you need that mind to be quieted at. Then, you've discovered what your outcome is, whether it's, simply in your day. Like, how do I want to feel at the end of the day? Where do I want to be at the end of the day? Quiet your mind and now start to backwards map. What are some of the simplest steps that it will take for me to get to that outcome, right? And so then afterwards, number 3 is train stillness. Okay, so practice just being without input. Put the phone up, cut off the TV, cut off Alexa, whatever it may be, and just simply be with your thoughts. Allow your thoughts to be your sharpening tool, right? There's an old saying that iron sharpens iron. In this sense, quiet and stillness will sharpen your thoughts and your mind. Okay, and so that's how we're going to apply that understanding. So, again, anchoring in that moment, then reverse read the situation or backwards map. So being able to start with the end in mind and come all the way backwards, and then train stillness. Just practice being without anything, no sound, no movement, just being still in your thoughts and allowing your mind to be sharpened by stillness. So this is not something that I would say is easy. It does take intentionality. And it's intentional warfare against yourself, essentially, because you're starting to tell your mind and your way of being that, hey, we're no longer going to do this. We're actually going to intercept that with a process to help us get to where we want to be, or we're going to intercept that with the process to help refine the way that we make decisions and the way we move. So that is function. Let's move on into freedom. What does this unlock internally for you? When you learn to bridle your mind, you essentially are learning to reshape your own story. You become the author of your own story. And in doing that, you stop being dragged by anxiety or like essentially impulsive decision making, and you start redirecting your focus to be able to look at the outcome you want and then essentially walk the path to get there. I often use a metaphor when I'm doing professional developments that if you're from the city of Chicago, You can see the Sears Tower, or now the Willis Tower, from practically anywhere in the city. Maybe except for on foggy days. But if it's a nice clear day outside, from miles out, you can see that Sears Tower. Now, that being said, consider the Sears Tower as your outcome. You can see the outcome, but you may not have a direct path on how to get there. You just know what direction you want to head in. And so think of that very much as this process, like instilling your mind and focusing on what the end should look like. Imagine that as being your Sears Tower. You may not know exactly how to get there or what that route may be, but you know what direction you're headed in. And that's always where you want to start. As you start heading in that direction, you may encounter detours. You may encounter blocks in your path. You may even have to take a few steps backwards and remap your route, right? But essentially, you are heading in the direction of your outcome, and you have your eyes stayed on your outcome. So that way, you know you're always headed in the right direction. If we don't know where we're headed, then you could be walking around in circles and never really even going anywhere, right? And so that is the idea here. So, again, when you learn to bridle that mind, freedom doesn't come from more control, but more so from calm control, from realizing that every decision is rooted in what that outcome is supposed to be. And so you begin to trust your ability to think clearly and pause before reacting. And essentially you let peace lead your next move. It's not coming from a place of chaos. So that is our 4F formula for today. Again, the fact portion, what is undeniably true here, just looking at the fact that sustained focus is really going to be what leads that outcome out thoroughly, right? And then fluency, what deeper understanding must we develop, is that it takes training to bridle the mind. This is not something that is going to be a right away outcome. And so using that idea of the screen time, where like, hey, I want to see what being under an hour looks like. And then having the rude awakening that, you're under an hour before even half of the day is out. But then starting to practice that muscle to where, okay, let me restrain a little bit. Let me push some of this time back. And before you know it, you'll find that you're able to squeeze a full hour into a full day. And then that function piece is anchoring in the moment, reverse read the situation or backwards map it. And then lastly, just train stillness, train being in the moment. And then freedom essentially is just reclaiming the authorship of your story, reclaiming that, hey, that is my outcome. I know where I am going now, and I am going to walk in that direction. It may take me a little bit longer than I would like to get there, but that is okay. Remember, if we go back to that episode around cheating the pace, you don't want to cheat the pace, right? And so you've set your eyes on what that outcome is. Don't cheat the pace. Move at your speed, okay? Now, we've talked about our 4F formula. Now we want to get into what our spiritual lens on this is. What is our scriptural lens? And this is going to come from Proverbs 25:28. You'll probably get mostly Proverbs scriptures from me, considering that what I'm giving is wisdom-based learning. And so, Proverbs is the book of wisdom from Solomon. So Proverbs 25:28, whoever has no rule over his own spirit is like a city broken down without walls. So when you are not able to pause, be in the moment, and understand why you're making every decision that you're making, essentially you're open to invasion of anything. So any feeling that comes in can push you to make a decision that doesn't lead you towards your goal, because you have no rule over your own spirit. You're just kind of flowing based off emotion. You're kind of flowing based off the circumstance. There is no end in mind. And so that should ground you in the spiritual aspect. Again, whosoever has no rule over his own spirit is like a city broken down and without walls. You are open for invasion. Anyone can come in and influence your way of thinking. There's an old saying that if you don't stand for something, you will fall for anything. So ask yourself, what is it that I'm standing on in this current moment, whether it be with life, whether it be with the next project, whether it be with school, whatever it may be, what am I standing on, so that way I don't fall for anything. And then if you know Robert Greene's laws, you probably already figured out which one I am leaning into today. And that is going to be law 29, plan all the way to the end. Focus is not about forcing the mind to be quiet. It's about giving it direction. And so Greene teaches that, power belongs to those who think beyond the moment. You see the outcome and you work backwards with intention to get to that particular outcome. My mom's lesson was very much a metaphor of that. She taught me like, hey, read the last page first. Understand what the outcome of the story is, and that will help you start to check off the boxes of understanding along the way and use the context clues on how did they get to that outcome. And so she was teaching me something subconsciously that I have been able to use within my own life of like, hey, what is your last page? What's that strategy look like for yourself? If somebody was to open up the last book or the last page of your life, how would that chapter read? And you can be the author of that chapter. So we have looked at both the Robert Greene and the scriptural parts of this. Now we're going to look at the POS model. What pillars do these actually lean into? Primarily, they're going to lead into social emotional learning and spirituality. This episode builds essentially emotional awareness, is going to build from that SEO component of thinking about why I'm doing some of the things that I do, why am I not able to still myself, but also leans into that self-management piece and really being able to focus in on what it is that you're trying to get to. So through reflection on focus, trauma, and reprogramming our attention, this will help us from an SEO standpoint. And then lastly, spiritually thinking about this, teaching that quiet is not emptiness, it's clarity. And so just sitting in stillness, as we talked about that function piece, when you sit in that stillness, it allows your thoughts to be sharpened, and it helps you to become more focused. Now, we're going to wrap up with our personal and our business application. So from a personal standpoint, really just reiterating what it is that we've already said is using that last page first strategy to, lead yourself into your next conversation, your next meeting, whatever part of your day that you want to have a specific definition to. I mean, it could be simple as using it to, define how you want your holidays to go. We're coming up on the holidays, right? So how do I want to spend these last couple of weeks of the year? Like, how do I want to feel on December 31st? You can use it for something as simple as that, and then begin to backwards map, what do I need to do to get to that outcome? A lot of us have New Year's resolutions that we want to put into place. Write that last chapter. Like, if I really lean into that resolution, what does that last chapter look like? Okay. And so for the business application, teams that learn to slow down their thinking before reacting create fewer errors and more strategic moves. Teach your team to pause, to clarify, and then execute. So whatever it is that you're either leading at work or whatever it is that you're a part of at work, again, begin with leaning into like, what do we want this to look like at the end? Practice stillness, which will then promote clarity, and then execute accordingly. Okay. So with our closing reflection, when I think back on those reading tests, I realized that they were never about how many words per minute that I could read, or like how much of that story that I could get in and comprehend so that I can answer these questions. It was really about how many of those moments in my mind that I could quiet. When it was time to be still, that's what it was really about. And so it was never really about the stories, but more so, how was I being still in those moments to be able to take in what that story actually was. And so that's the real work that we want to lean into. Life will always hand us stories that we did not write. The question is, how do we choose to read those stories? How do we choose to embrace the outcomes of those stories? So remember, bridle your mind, slow your spirit, and remember, focus is not just a skill, but it is a discipline, both spiritually and personally. So with that, we hope that you enjoyed this episode. Again, you are on the Q with Q, and this is episode 4 of Q the Mind, the last page strategy, gaining control of a wandering mind. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.